Welcome to Pioneer Mindset, a place where we challenge our mindset and address the discomfort in both business and life by finding clarity resulting in bold conviction. I'm your host, Garrett Ruskamp, fifth generation farmer, husband, and father from rural Nebraska. Whether you're navigating frustration from past decisions or worry about the uncertainty you face today in your business, we're going to learn from our struggles and take on new challenges with a resilient mindset. Join me as I share my journey of struggles I've faced in agriculture as a farmer and family man. I'm ready to dive into honest conversations to tackle the mindsets surrounding key issues that rural ag business owners face that will ultimately help you gain control, leading to a profitable and sustainable business. Let's adapt to Pioneer Mindset and get to it. Welcome back, everyone, to this week's episode of Pioneer Mindset. So if you didn't catch last week's episode, I took you kind of on an audio field day of our farm here at Ruskamp Farms, and we talked about our strip crop trial. Going to continue this field day experience, if you will, being we are in kind of that tail end of growing season, but we've done a lot this year, and we've seen a lot of our progress take place over the summer and seen how the crops are looking on different practices that we've tried. And so going to kind of continue that and kind of talking about the different practices that we're doing on our farm. The big goal here, kind of like I mentioned last time, is to share the different things that we're doing, not to say that we're doing things right, just to share. But truthfully, I hope I can learn something by sharing what we're doing with others. I hope I can learn something as well from others as they give me feedback as well. That's kind of the benefit of a field day, kind of having those conversations, the networking, if you will. A lot of good values that come from that. So going to continue. We took a look at the strip crop trial. So if you're ready, now we can jump back onto the hay rack ride, sit down next to your buddy here on the straw bales, and we'll go on to the next field. Chugga, 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 chugga. Yep. All right. We are at the next field. Boom, right there. It was actually right next to it. So we're going to be talking about our small grains were next and our wheat crop that we had and our rye crop this year. And it was literally right next to it. If you heard me mention on last week's episode, the rye was actually on the outside, right around the strip crop field there. So we'll start with that one first. The rye this year, rye is one of those crops where we just don't necessarily do a lot with it. It's a pretty similar program to our wheat. It's variety non-stated rye that we plant out there. I can't remember what our seeding rate was, probably about 80, 90 pounds to the acre. And overall, we just don't do a lot with it. Our small grains, we don't spray with a herbicide. We'll stream bar some nitrogen and sulfur out there and some humic acid. And then we will come back with a dry spreader pass. And I can't remember, honestly, I didn't look that up ahead of time, but I think we put some sulfur in there, just very little potash, but some sulfur, some potash, and I might have even had some Pell lime in there. I can't remember for sure. That's my bad for not looking that up. Hit me up if you want to learn more about our dry pass on that. But then anyways, we will also come back and we did fungicide this and foliar feeded this with potassium acetate, some sugar, some fulvic acid, and then we did run a fungicide on this as well. And so that's the nature of kind of what we do with our small grains. Pretty much the same for wheat and rye. So our rye this year did about 55 bushels per acre. Overall, pretty pleased with that. I would say that's about average for the few years that we've been raising rye. I'd say that's about average. So we're happy with that. And we were a lot earlier this year on our small grains, not just rye, but wheat as well. We were probably at least 10 days to 2 weeks ahead of schedule, which doesn't necessarily change much. Usually in the back of my mind, I'm like, okay, if we are ahead of schedule, are we going to be giving up a little bit of yield? Maybe that was the case, with our small grains. It's a different time of year when it matters. Everybody talks about timely rains. Timely rains make the grain. It's kind of the same thing with these small grains, but it's a different time of year. All right, we need to have that moisture kind of in early spring. We need to make sure we have some moisture in the fall to get a good fall crop established, get some good growth out of it in the fall. And the big thing with these small grains is the planting date is extremely important. The earlier we can get that in, the sooner we can get that stuff up in the fall, get some good fall growth and kind of build up those reserves before we go into winter and go dormant. And then in the spring, it just kind of comes up so much faster if we've got some fall growth there as well. And so it really just kind of depends on the rains. And we were drier in the spring. We had just a little bit of moisture last fall, enough to get it up and established, but we were drier this spring. And then we did catch some rains right around that May, June timeframe, which I think is really what ultimately kind of saved some of that yield. And so we were altogether pretty pleased with our small grains. So our wheat did about 93 bushels per acre. So they're literally right next to it. The wheat field and the rye field were right next to each other. It's all kind of in the same area there. And so we were pretty happy with the wheat yields being 93. Over all of our years of raising wheat, there's maybe a couple years, and I can pinpoint the years. 2023 was a rough one. That was like a 25 bushel an acre wheat crop. To us, that's considered pretty much a failure. And the other year was last year, actually. There was a couple other years in there where we only did about 70 bushels per acre. Otherwise, I'd say we're upwards to that 85 to 90. I've had good years where we're 100 plus, but 90 is a pretty consistent yield. When we're doing our projections, we're throwing out about 85 bushels per acre on our wheat crop. So pretty happy with that. Now, with our wheat and rye this year, we actually did make the decision to bale the straw. We haven't done that for a few years. It's been nice to actually not have to worry about baling it because you just spread it and you can come back literally as soon as the combine gets done, you can drill it and get that crop in there. But we did go ahead and decide to bale the straw. And we got roughly 4 bales to the acre, but these are light bales, so it's going to be right around 2 ton to the acre. And now, just for context, when it comes to the business side, the economic side, right? This is probably the only crop that we got like harvest results from this year. And side comment, that's what's also nice about having a different rotation in here is we've got maybe a different income source, different time of year, helps with cash flow, it helps with labor, helps with utilizing equipment that we already have at a different time of year, different things like that. Lots of benefits there to kind of changing up that rotation. But from an economic standpoint, right now, we've had bids anywhere from $85 to a ton or $100 a ton on a few of these straw bales. So, I mean, that's, at minimum $160 an acre back with that straw. Now I get it. We are removing those nutrients. We are removing a lot of the carbon, removing a lot of the organic matter, if you will. But the reason we'd made that decision is because we are going to have a compost product spread back out there. It's already done. And we're planning a cover crop back in there. We'll probably graze it to some extent. So I don't think it's going to necessarily be a huge net negative by pulling that straw off. And we are able to capitalize on that additional revenue pulled off in the form of the straw. So that's kind of why we went ahead and made that decision. And so the other thing I want to mention on the different trials, a couple little things that we did on the wheat this year. So we did actually put Pivot Bio's Proven 40 as the seed treatment. We did that on the wheat seed itself. So we did that on the wheat seed. And so overall, I was kind of really curious to see how that was going to work out. Once again, it was one of those things to where, if you want to factor in, maybe you're getting 20 to 30 pounds out of that for a per pound basis, that it was fairly reasonable when it comes to like a pound of nitrogen, what a pound of nitrogen cost, right? And so that's why we went ahead and tried that this year. Looking at the maps, we did put a check strip in there. It's really hard to say. When we're just looking at yield maps, and I went ahead just before I was on hit record, I went ahead and pulled up my operations center on my John Deere and was trying to kind of figure out, okay, is there much of a yield difference? Because basically the unchecked was basically without less nitrogen, right? It was all treated the same. So you would think that there would be a maybe yield deficit there, and I didn't really see anything. So it's one of those things with the trials, and I kind of stated that disclaimer before. Got to state that on the microphone. Hey, this is a disclaimer. We're not a research center, all this other stuff. This is just things that we are experiencing or seeing, but it probably needs to be replicated. And so it's really hard to say. Now, furthermore, on that same note, though, on the same note of nitrogen, so one thing that we did is when we streamed that nitrogen on with the sprayer or streamer tips, I did go ahead and leave a couple of check strips where we didn't apply that nitrogen to these check strips. It's not like I cut my rate. I just flat out did not apply that. And I was able to go back and look at those. And surprisingly, not necessarily surprisingly, but there was a yield hit. And, that's one of those things to where, like, whenever you're doing a check like that, you're basically checking to see if the input that you're paying for, in this case, the nitrogen, is actually paying off. And so, one, if you're constantly applying the nitrogen, you probably in some way, shape, or form want to see it paying off because you've been spending all this money for all these years or decades or whatever, right? So you want to see that pay off. At the same token, like, if it doesn't, well, maybe we can reduce it. That's anytime I do a check with like an input of any sorts, I always got mixed feelings about wanting it to pay off. Like, do we want it to pay off? Do we want to have a high ROI with that input? Yeah, we want to be able to apply maybe an input and then make 5x off of it. That'd be great. But at the same time, if we don't need it, I don't want it to be right like in the middle. I want it to be really positive or not show anything so I don't have to worry about applying it in the future. Well, with this, I think it was about 15 bushels is what I could come up with comparing the yields between those two different blocks, right? It was about a 15 bushel an acre cut. And we cut the nitrogen was, I think, it was about 17 gallons. And so some of that was ammonium thiosulfate, there's some humic in there. and stuff like that. And so we basically cut that right around probably 45, 50 pounds is what it's cutting. So it's a pretty big hit. I mean, it's not like it's just 20 pounds, cutting 20 pounds out. And that would maybe be of a little bit of a better check. And I'll have to kind of do that in future. But I definitely saw a negative yield response by not having that extra nitrogen out there. Furthermore, on the checks, we did have a fungicide and a foliar application made to this wheat with the drone. And I was going back and trying to look at the application maps that they sent me based off the yield maps and trying to kind of pinpoint that. And there too, for whatever the reason, I actually could not see much of a yield difference, which was kind of disappointing because so they left the check with no fungicide and just the foliar application, which I believe was like potassium acetate, fulvic, sugar, might have been like a kelp in there. I can't remember. I left no fungicide in there, so it did not see a difference without the fungicide. Take that as you will. And then we left a check in there with nothing applied, where they did not apply the foliar at all. And I still didn't see much of a hit. So it's like, okay, that's an interesting one. We'll have to kind of keep diving into that and keep doing some checks as well. But just wanted to pass along, that's some of the different things that we're doing on our wheat crop and small grains. And I guess one more comment on that with our wheat crop. So we'll go ahead and harvest that. We did harvest it already, and then we planted our cover crop back into that. We planted a really diverse mix. I want to say it was like a 7 or 8 way mix. Some grasses, some legumes to fix the nitrogen. Some of the grasses will be good for grazing, like a sorghum sudan. Usually purple top turnips in there, or tillage radish, I should say, not turnips. And then sunflowers, a couple other things in there, and really just a really diverse mix. And I took all of our old corn and soybean seed, because you always got a few bags laying around that cleaned out the planter or didn't use. And we threw all that in there. We just got rid of it. And so some of that stuff was actually coming up pretty good for the little moisture that we did have. That was kind of the benefit of actually getting it off early before we got all this hot weather, is I think that it saved just a little bit of moisture out there. So it actually did germinate within about 4 or 5 days. It was germinated and it was coming up, which was extremely impressive to see that when it got so hot and dry. So that is our small grains. Now we're going to jump back on the hay rack ride and we're going to chug, go down to the next one. Now I want to go back and kind of shift gears back to the corn side. Within our corn this year, we actually decided we were going to try some non-GMO corn. Pretty excited to try some of that. And the reason why, and I want to make sure that I'm sharing the reason why behind we do all these things, because that's the most important part, is if I share everything that we do, but I forget to share why, it's going to have probably no value to you at the end of the day. So the reason why I wanted to try some non-GMO corn was strictly because of the price of the seed corn. With talking with other people, seeing the price differences on the seed corn, on the non-GMO corn being a lot cheaper, I thought, hey, let's try it. I've heard a lot of people say there's not much of a yield drag. Yes, we can't spray Roundup with it. We just got to be a little bit more careful. So overall, I was just really curious to see, okay, what is this going to be like? So we did it on about a quarter of our acres. We did it basically on 2 fields. And so maybe it wasn't even quite a quarter, but either way, went ahead and tried some few different varieties, a couple different brands. And we went ahead and we planted a Pioneer 13777, 13777, which was the same one that, if you remember from the strip crop trial, the same one, it's just the conventional number. Then we tried some Whiffles. So we had a Whiffles 6110, and then we had a Whiffles 7940. And then I tried some Bass seed as well. So the variety there was Vera, was the name of it. And so really excited about all 4 of those, really. Heard a lot of good things about some of those different brands. So yeah, we tried some different things. We split the planter in some places, well, most places I should say. So we went ahead and we'll have a pretty good kind of trial out there this fall once we come back and see how it does. And so we planted that. We had in both of those fields, I had a twin row cover crop. So we drilled the twin row. And by the way, with the twin row, to kind of hit on that right now real quick. So our twin row cover crop, we've been doing this for 2 years, picked up this idea. Did not create this, picked up this idea by a guy named Greg Keller, the king of the twin row cover crops. He basically kind of started doing this a few years ago, and it really piqued my interest because the idea of the twin row is that it's not a solid seed in front of corn and it's less competition. So we're basically planting 2 rows 7.5 inches apart, and then we're leaving a gap. And so then we're leaving like a 15-inch gap and then planting another 2 rows. So we basically just take our air seeder, and for just simply put, we block off 2 rows, we leave 2 rows on, and we just go kind of plant it that way. And it works really well. The last couple of years we've tried it. I always had some hesitations because our air seeder is a 30-foot air seeder, planter's 40 foot. How are we going to make this work? Is it going to match up? Is it going to line up? We're running RTK, but we don't have implement guidance or anything like that. Well, for the most part, it doesn't have to be an exact science. It's not quite like strip till to where it has to be on the gnat's ass, if you will. We're able to kind of stay in between the rows. And if we have to, we just kind of bump our GPS line one way or the other. And we're, for the most part, be able to keep the planter row in between the kind of cover crop strips there. With that, there's less competition, conserves a little bit of moisture in there, and it just plants really well. Honestly, it just does really well. But with this cover crop back to non-GMO, I wanted to make sure I terminated that before we planted. Being this is non-GMO corn, if I plant the corn and I, for some reason, ran into a rain delay or can't get it sprayed and that rye or whatever we have is still there and I don't get it killed before the corn crop comes up, well, I'm kind of out of options. There's not a lot I can do at that point. So I went ahead and terminated the cover crop ahead of time. I sprayed my pre like I would my corn pre, sprayed that out, terminated the cover crop ahead of time. And then I came back just a few days later and went ahead and planted my corn. And it worked really well. The only thing I will say that we kind of learned this year is when you spray your pre ahead of planting and then you come back and you plant. And then in these two fields specifically, kind of going back to a lot of our wind issues with these cover crops, is we had a lot of wind erosion because, when we came through and we planted in the fall, it was pretty dry. We had a lot of windy days. Even on these bean stubble fields, kind of on the hills, we had it where the residue just moved on us. The wind literally moved the residue, kind of pulled it into the ditches, skimmed the hilltops, were pretty bare. I'd say on both these fields, we probably had maybe 20% damage, maybe a little bit more. But anyways, the residue was so uneven that I decided to run my row cleaners a little bit deeper just so I could get all that trash out of the way. By doing so, we moved the residual. When we apply our residual with our pre, that's got to be applied to the soil. Then we move that and we open that canopy up and it helps plant the corn really well, but it also helps plant the seeds, or the seeds get the sunlight and then they germinate. So we had quite a few weed escapes that came through. Therefore, kind of like I mentioned on the strip crop, we had to come back and spray our post a lot earlier. We had maybe not the best weed control, but it was probably just due to timing. Maybe if a guy would run the row cleaners less aggressively or just doing something a little bit different that way, I think that we could get a little bit better weed control. But in that same regard, coming back on the weed control, when we did come back and we sprayed our post, everybody wants to know okay, you're planting non-GMO corn. How can you do that? How are you going to keep it clean? What do you actually spray? The only thing we don't spray is we don't spray Roundup. You can still spray your atrazine. You can still spray your residuals. We just pulled out the Roundup and we actually added crop oil. That was the only difference, is we added the crop oil to kind of help get that stickiness, if you will, onto the weeds, kind of break that waxy coat that the weeds sometimes have. And then we kept our fulvic acid in there to help those weeds translocate. And I think that especially helps when you got a little bit bigger weeds. So overall, I was pretty pleased once we came back with that post. We had some bigger water hemp out there, some bigger kochia. We were able to clean it up pretty good for the most part. So I was pretty happy with how we were able to clean that up. And overall, it looked pretty good. Otherwise, it's kind of just following our traditional corn program. And whether it be kind of with our nitrogen, we went ahead and streamed on our nitrogen right after we planted it. And then we came back and we side dressed. So that was pretty much it. I'm really excited about the non-GMO corn just to see what it can do, if it can just at least hang in there with our traded varieties, right? And with the fact that it's cheaper. And so for context on the economic side, I say it's cheaper, but I would say on average, it's probably about $100 a bag cheaper. So $100 a bag probably equates to $30 an acre, maybe a little bit more. So that's saving in seeds right there. So that's why I'm pretty excited about this. And just to try it. And then the other benefit with this is something to kind of keep in mind for the future is now when we come back and we go to beans next year, or if we want to go corn on corn, we don't have to worry about volunteer corn. We can spray that off. It's going to get smoked when we spray our next herbicide pass, right? When we keep Roundup in there. So, we don't have to have corn killer in there if we go to beans. We don't have to have that coletanum or maybe even that crop oil in there. And so that saves a little bit of money there and cheaper seed. It's just, there's a lot of benefits that I can see to it. So really excited about this non-GMO corn. Not to say we're going to go the whole farm on this stuff, but I think it'll do well. And so the other thing that I will say from an economic standpoint, everybody's been asking, well, do you have a market for it? Obviously, that'd be great if I could go get maybe another 30, 40, 50 cents for this non-GMO corn. I haven't necessarily looked that hard, but the little looking that I have done, talking to a few other people, a lot of these non-GMO markets have kind of dried up. There's just maybe there are very little demand and maybe what is there is definitely kind of oversaturated because people are looking into this more. So as of now, I'm not planning on marketing it separately. I'm planning on just kind of running it in with the rest of our corn. The sole purpose there is economically, so I can just try to save my seed cost. And then a few of those other costs that kind of go along with that as well. All right. So we talked about the non-GMO corn, talked about the twin row cover crops. Really excited to continue doing that as well. Might even do that a little bit in front of beans, just to kind of see how that works out. Cover crop in front of corn. So going to go back onto the next field, right? And so cover crop in front of corn. Now, this is one that a lot of people have mixed feelings on. Even if you like cover crops, like using rye or some other cover crop, even if you like doing that, using cover crop in front of corn, most will say it just doesn't work. And I would not go that far. Now, would I say it's the best thing in the world? Is it as easy as putting a cover crop in front of beans? No, it's not the easiest in the world. So we had a solid seeded cover crop, is what I'm talking about here. We had some solid seeded cover crop in front of corn on some of our acres. And I will definitely say it's got to be managed properly. And you got to have like perfect conditions as far as timing and termination, and then planting, and then obviously moisture. So going into the spring, we were drier, but yet we still caught some rains. And by the time we got to the field and got it planted, I think it was probably at least foot to 18 inches tall in some places. And we had some rye out there. We had some actually winter barley. We had some winter pea. So just some variety of a cover crop, which was really nice to see that variety out there. It actually did pretty well overwintering. But, within that, I would say it definitely kind of set that corn back a little bit. That's still kind of a learning curve, still an ongoing experience. And we'll see what the combine's like when she rolls through this fall. But that's why I'm really leaning more towards that twin row cover crop in front of corn. Now, in front of beans, cover crop in front of beans, this is probably the lowest hanging fruit out there if nobody's tried the cover crops. We've been doing cover crop in front of beans for 8, 9, 10 years, something like that. I can't even remember. But it's one of those that's fairly easy in that as long as you don't let this crop get huge, and even if you do, like as long as you got some moisture, it's usually not the end of the world. I'd say this year was one of those years where we were trying to manage moisture in the spring. So we did have a couple of fields that kind of got away from us, got to back again that probably 18 inches tall, maybe a little bit more. When we're going through that field and it's hitting the top of that basically toolbar on the planter, yeah, she's getting a little bit tall. And I know some people are going to be yelling at me thinking that that's not very tall at all. And I understand we've planted through a lot thicker stuff. But when you're in a dry year, you got to manage that moisture a little bit as well. That's one thing that, when we do our timing wise, when it comes to cover crop in front of beans, typically I like to plant it and then I like to wait about 3 days, 2-3 days. And then I'll go ahead and come back and terminate the rye after that. So that's kind of our standard program. It just kind of depends. And sorry, I keep bouncing around a lot here, going back and forth between fields and practices. But back to our cover crop in front of corn, that one I will try to terminate earlier before I plant it, if I can. Now, some people will say, okay, you're going to terminate that rye or that cover crop, and it's going to put off, I'm drawing a blank on it right now, but it's going to put off some sort of gas that when it dies, that it's going to be hard to plant through. Yeah, you can see, I will not admit that, but you can see some challenges when you terminate early, and the fact of sometimes that plant gets a little bit waxy. So when it comes to beans, I like to plant it green, and then I'll come back and terminate it. When it comes to corn and a solid seeded stand, that's the key. On a solid seeded stand, I will like to terminate that earlier if I can, like potentially even 2 weeks earlier. It just depends on the year. And that's the hardest part about anybody that wants to use cover crops, myself included, is we all want this play-by-play, this recipe. It hits 14 inches and you go spray it and you do this, that, or the other thing. Well, there's so many factors, especially with the rye, that we're trying to make sure we've got the proper temperatures, conditions for spraying, and then moisture when when do we terminate? There's so many factors to consider here. It's just different every year. I've got an idea as to how I want to kind of go about things. But going into the year, it's literally just a play-by-play, figure it out as we go kind of mentality there. And so that's why it just really depends. And so the one thing I will say with our cover crop, our rye in front of beans this year, though, this is kind of a rare thing that we've actually had happen this year, is I don't know if we didn't wait long enough, we didn't have the right conditions after we planted or something, but we had a lot of escapes with the rye. And we came through and we sprayed the rye. It looks like it's dead right away. And then all of a sudden, 10 days, 2 weeks later, there's still some green out there. Why is that green? And it seemed like it was where we ran the row cleaners or where the row ran. And so I think that was part of it. And so that one was kind of puzzling because I didn't necessarily make a separate rescue pass. But by the time we came back out with our post and we tried to come out with that fairly early, tried to make sure we're definitely doing that before summer solstice. So I think it was right around like the 12th of June. We were a little bit earlier, which was helpful in this case, was we still had some rye scragglers, some rye that was out there. So that was kind of different for us. I don't know if anybody else has kind of experienced that same thing. We got it pretty easy kind of the second time around, but that was definitely one thing that we had noticed. That was an odd one for us. I guess the last thing that I want to touch on here, because I want to be respectful of your time as I'm just talking about our farm and all of our stuff. And obviously, this would be great if it was a two-way conversation. We'd love to hear your thoughts on a lot of this stuff. But the last thing that I want to kind of touch on here was the reduced nitrogen trial that we currently have. And it's when I say trial on our farm, it is a trial. We do have a side-by-side, but it's not like a replicated true research trial like we're seeing up at Ag PhD Field Day or like strips of 120 feet throughout entire 80 acres or something like that. But this is just, maybe a couple fields where I decided to shut the sprayer off when we're spraying our nitrogen or leave something out. And so I will be kind of curious to see what that is like. So with our nitrogen program, the way that our nitrogen program kind of works is the last probably 4 years, we have been using Pivot Bio Proven 40. Now, regardless of whatever your feelings are of that product, and this could be a side conversation, we've continued to use it. I can't say 100% sure like the true results that we've had. And then you're probably wondering like, why would you use something if you can't see the results? Well, it's not that I don't think it's working, but it's just hard to say. It's hard to say, and that's back to why we put in these nitrogen trials. And every year we try to maybe put a check strip in, but it's maybe not a perfect place to check it, or we got to replicate it, or maybe the weather wasn't great in this field, or we had a yield hit in this field, so it was hard to tell. So many different factors included there. I would say in general, so the way that we do this is we basically we're shooting for right around that 160 pounds of nitrogen. And our yield goal is about 200, 225, somewhere in that range. It just kind of depends. And we can raise some pretty good corn off of those nitrogen goals, right? And so we're shooting for about 160. But we pull that, we give the credit to Pivot Bio Proven 40. It's called 40. So you're kind of estimating 40 pounds of nitrogen is what you will get from that product. So we back that down. So our synthetic is somewhere around 120. Now we're flirting with that and trying to back that down a little bit further by using, humic acid in there, or using a stabilizer, or using a product called Nitro Booster, which is kind of to help the accumulation of that product of the nitrogen. And so I think we can back down even further yet. So we've got some fields this year where like we've only got maybe 100 to 120 pounds of synthetic. And those aren't manure applied fields either, by the way. We do use some manure. Those are treated differently. Those, we take the nitrogen credit into consideration. And then we basically take the balance to get us up to around that 160 plus the 40 pounds from the Pivot Bio. So that's kind of how we do that rough math. And so this year we did have a couple, when we were streaming on our nitrogen on a couple of our fields with the sprayer right after planting, going back, I had cut the rate in one spot and I completely shut the boom off in one spot. So I can't remember what the cut was, but it's probably around that 50 pounds. So we're going to have one kind of check strip that has cut by 50 pounds and probably another one that's cut by 25 pounds. And I'll be really curious to see how those turn out, because I think overall, from an industry, we're probably over applying on the nitrogen side. I think we can definitely be more efficient from the nitrogen side. And especially this year, when we're talking, close to $1 per pound of nitrogen, that's outrageous. And we need to really figure out what's the things that we can do to really hone that in. And even if you pre-bought early, maybe, you got it locked in earlier like some did, that's great. That definitely helps, but that doesn't mean that we have to be lazy in how we're managing that nitrogen. So ourselves included, we could definitely do a better job as managing that nitrogen. But part of how we do that is figuring out, okay, where can we back this down? Where do we see this bump and where does it actually affect? And this goes back to the Pivot Bio. Are we able to just raise 200 plus bushel corn on 120 pounds of synthetic? We got some decent organic matter levels. We've got the decomposition of the stover or of the cover crop. Our soils, we've been planting cover crops for quite a while, so we've got a lot of good nutrients in there. The soil should be working pretty good to kind of help create that nitrogen throughout the season, that nitrogen release, right? The nutrient release. So I think that we can do a lot of good things there. So now, can we back that down even further? I don't know. That's what we're ultimately trying to figure out on our farm. I think others should be kind of looking at that as well, because there's definitely some cost savings on that. So, I mean, honestly, folks, that's kind of the field day on our farm, if you will. I mean, now you got to listen to me talk for two different parts, two different episodes here, probably close to an hour. You didn't have to drive to our farm. You can if you want to see it. I'm hoping to kind of host a little bit of a field day, very, very informal coming up here. But that's something that hopefully you can maybe, as I was talking, maybe there's something that you picked up and you're like, oh, that's intriguing, or why did you do it that way? After you listen to this episode, shoot me a message, or you can find my information to kind of message me on our website, pioneerfarmer.org. I'll be happy to have that conversation, because I am a farmer, I'm a business owner. I put my farmer hat on all the time, and I put my business owner hat all the time. So I like kind of doing both. I like the variety of things. And so I definitely like having these conversations, talking about where can we utilize cover crops. How can we use everything that I talked about today on our farm? How can we use this to make the most out of it, right? Or how can we use this information, maybe even use it to apply for different programs that are out there? We didn't even get into that conversation. That's a conversation for another day. But there's a lot of different ways a guy can either cut your input cost or add revenue, and ultimately take your farm in the right direction. We're not trying to cut yield at the same token, right? We're trying to do our best to kind of keep that yields the same, be more profitable. At the end of the day, we just all want to put more of those dollars back into our pockets instead of somebody else's. And I think this is a way that we're going to start to get there, at least going in the right direction. At least I hope we are. I've seen a lot of the benefits on our own farm, and that's why we continue to do this as well. We'd love to have the conversation further, if you will. But anyways, that's really all I got for this week's episode on the audio tour, the audio field day, if you will. And I also, let me know if you liked this. Let me know if you like me talking about the farm side with whether it be the cover crops or just even what we're doing on our farm. If you want to learn more, if you like this type of conversation, let me know. I would surely appreciate that. That's all I got for this week's episode. We'll catch you guys next time. Thanks for tagging along with me today as we sharpened our mindsets. If you've gained insight from today's episode, be sure to take a screenshot to share or send this episode to somebody who might also find value in it. For more, follow me on Instagram @HereAtRustCamp or on Facebook, and join me next time for more conviction through clarity.